So let's assign to Zizek the side of um, the rationalist, where rationalist still has some connection to the rational is the real, the saying in Hegel, and therefore also to the French Revolution, French rationalism, to Kant, and so on, and in a way to the whole tradition. Um, One of the things that prompted me to this, and let's say, let's remember that Zizek says one of the worst things, uh, the worst part of Heidegger is shown in Heidegger's little short couple pages where he says why he didn't accept the call to a position at Berlin. Why, I think it's called something like "Why I Stay in the Provinces." Um, So this essay, in a way, links to the second form of history, the history as reverence, the history as rootedness in the past, and in a way, it has, in fact, a kind of rationalist feel to it, in the sense that one receives, or let's say, yeah, that's wrong. It has a pre-rationalist feel to it. One receives from one's ancestors the mores, the way to the habits of life, and one reposes in them, as it were, and therefore they're not questioned. So therefore, we don't come into this question of a kind of Socratic theoretical question where. Which in some vague way I think has to do with the breakdown of right and left, because also the right has to bring everything to this level that Nietzsche is saying. There's some issue in Nietzsche between the question of resentment and ressentiment. I think there's some subtlety there, what ressentiment means rather than resentment. But what I learned from Strauss, whether or not this is explicitly Strauss's view, but what he prompted me to think is that it may be his view, I'm not certain, but that what Nietzsche has in mind here with regard to resentment is it can't mean simply being against something, because obviously Nietzsche is actively calls himself the Antichrist. He's actively against. And he speaks of the reversal of Platonism, and so on. What he means is that you bring things into enough awareness that you can take a choice, and then it's no longer. One can no longer speak of the direction in a way. One can no longer speak of conserving the rootedness in the past, because one's taking an active choice right now. But what does Nietzsche see when he comes into this post-Kantian era where we see this question of the breakdown of the cardinal distinctions between things? This is part of what made me think about this in Heidegger's 38, 39 lectures. And I mostly still were on, even though I'm jumping around in the lectures, we're mostly still on the early comments. And one of the things Heidegger is saying is between a motorcycle and a periwinkle, between the number 3 and Kleist, Prince of Hamburg, what comparison? He says, in typical Heidegger style, he speaks of, he gives this, Heidegger gives these determinations of everything in a way that Nietzsche doesn't, including in this essay where he says Nietzsche doesn't properly distinguish between history and historiology, even though Nietzsche, I would say generally Nietzsche speaks in terms of the Greek terms, because as we said before, he speaks of his historia. He doesn't speak of Geschichte or of he doesn't speak in German. He speaks in of phenomena and of historia. He doesn't speak of he speaks from the tradition quite a bit, and then even the only time he speaks of Tatsache as facts is when he's speaking against the British empiricism, as it were. Otherwise, usually, as in Beyond Good and Evil, when he says everything is interpretations, he says it's not phenomena, and he's thinking of appearances in the Greek sense, appearances rather than truth. The only time in his little, I got mixed up on this at one point, the only time in his unpublished notes where he speaks about everything as interpretation, there's no facts, no Tatsaka, rather than phenomena, is when he's speaking explicitly against the rise of let's say, the Newtonian science. So from this point of view, the number 3 and Kleist, the Prince of Hamburg, regarded as something you can put on a scale and weigh or whatnot, or in some way compatible, in some way the same stuff, material. Everything breaks down. So rationality in the tradition of Kant, where Kant says one should follow this rule, one should never tell a lie, which is in a way this so-called Kant crisis in Kleist. It made me think of that, is that you have to come to this one end, this one way of doing things, which the American professors always present this falsely, because they act like it's a question of is this individual being manipulated or not, or is he being treated, they treat the kingdom of ends as though it were a question of somebody following their own ends, as though it were a question of pursuit of happiness. That's not at all what Kant's thinking about. What he's thinking is there's one end, there's one destiny to which by nature we have been called, by which it's similar to most of the traditional ways of thinking. Like we're called to the law, so the path, one right path, and that right path is never to tell a lie, and it's indifferent to each one and each other. It's the same. They have to do the same thing. It's not a question of some individual idiosyncratic Rousseauian kind of pursuit of happiness, but it's rather the Rousseauian you will merely be forced to be free, and being free means following the law. And this is why there's a break with the so-called romanticism from this. And this is also, I believe, why in Heidegger you see, instead of autonomy, he speaks of authenticity. This is the difference between autonomy and authenticity. And you can say, generally speaking, Kant, if you just regard it historically, Kant was speaking in the presence of the great hierarchies of privilege of the states and so on, the aristocracy, and the idea that everyone should follow the same law. Equality under the law was a great novelty at the time, so therefore he brought that to the metaphysical level. And the break between autonomy, spontaneously following this destiny that everyone should be called to as by their nature, looks different after one considers it afresh later on, and then you come to the notion of the authenticity, which is less, it's not bound by the categorical imperative, which is too leveling. It treats every situation as though it could be outside of time, and the solution the same for everyone at every time, and everyone the same. Everyone a rational being and the same. So I think one thing here, it does strike me that Nietzsche has kind of moved on. He's in an intermediary stage out of the Kantian stage. We've given up the Kantian stage, and partially from the trauma that we get from considering evolution metaphysically, the system of motion behind a periwinkle and behind a motorcycle, the same. The other issue is, what is this perspectivalism in Nietzsche? I should mention that it resembles a kind of transformed Kantianism of philosophy of access. So the examples that are actually given are not usually examples that one might think in terms of relativism of doctrine. It's rather that, for instance, here in the 38-39 lectures by Heidegger, he speaks of a hawk swooping down, this point of view of the hawk swooping down. Another place, of an insect somewhere in the grass that's very keenly aware of every small sound nearby, but when the retort of a bullet goes off, it doesn't notice it at all. This is a matter of perspective. And Nietzsche speaks of the plant striving for more life, as it were, on the edge of a rock face somewhere, a juniper tree on the edge of a rock face, let's say, and with its roots with no soil seeking life, and so on. And so you could see it from the point of view not just of, as Aristotle did, of animal life, but Aristotle also saw animal and plant life and these distinctions and the individuality of an animal or a plant, but he did not see it through the point of view of the philosophy of access, where access to reality. He saw it just plainly as something I can point to, an animal, a plant, and then I think about it. And then I project myself there and I say, how's it seeing things, as it were? What's it like for that? But I do not think about that in terms of any possible experience of access to reality as such. How so far, therefore, what I want to ask is, how so far is there simply a problem of a bias, as it were, in disposition, let's say Zizek, or a bias of disposition of Heidegger that creates this, and how so far is it a question of one has thought through everything there is to think through more cogently and arrived at the right position?